Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Keras Circle. Keras Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Keras Books, and Keras Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. Keras is very honored to welcome Dr. Alexandra Juhasz and Theodora Kerr in conversation with Justin C. Smith for a discussion of We Are Having This Conversation Now, the Times of AIDS Cultural Production. We Are Having This Conversation Now offers a history, present, and future of AIDS through 13 short conversations between Alex and Ted, scholars deeply embedded in HIV responses. This event is co-sponsored by Positive Impact Health Center. Positive Impact Health Center's mission is to provide client-centered care for the HIV community to have a life worth living. Keras is very honored to have Positive Impact be in our community, and we have long-time relationships with Positive Impact, so we're really, really glad to have them on board tonight. Alex has been making and thinking about AIDS activist video since the mid-1980s, and Ted is a writer and organizer whose work focuses primarily on HIV and AIDS. Justin C. Smith is the director of the Campaign to End AIDS at Positive Impact Health Centers in Atlanta, where he helped to develop and implement the Ending the HIV Epidemic strategy for Metro Atlanta. And I'll drop everyone's bios in the chat so that you can read more about these very accomplished folks. But in the interest of time, we got lots of juicy stuff to talk about. So I'm going to kick it over to Ted and Alex so that they can get right into telling us about this awesome book. So welcome to all three of you, and welcome to everybody watching at home. If you have questions, you can drop them in the chat or in the Ask a Question box at any time. And if there's time, we will weave those into the conversation. But in the meantime, let's get right into it. Thanks, y'all.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hi, Alex.
Hi, Ted and Justin.
Hey
Hi,
there.
Justin.
How you doing?
Good. So let's get into it, inspired by ER. So if you have not already done so, please feel free to pick up your copy of We Are Having This Conversation Now from Keras House Books. Alex, I'm going to say what it's about, and we're going to get into the timeline. Does that work for you?
It's perfect.
So, as ER said, it is 13 short conversations between Alex and myself where we talk about HIV, we talk about history, we talk about community, we talk about video, and every chapter is grounded in cultural products and production, and each chapter ends with prompts to invite you to be part of the conversation. The first half of the book is rooted in this notion of trigger, and the second half of the book is rooted in this notion of silence. And silence is always paired with something. And silence to us is not the absence of sound. It is how sometimes things get isolated and you can't make a loud noise. And so we need all the voices together. Alex, we didn't talk about this, but do you want to briefly say what trigger is?
Sure. Although, yeah. Let me say that, and then I'll add one more thing. So trigger in the book, it's half of the book, is a word that we learned from and honor from one community-based tape that was made at a time that we don't know, in the late 1980s, at an organization that was formerly known as Babashi, Blacks Educating Blacks. I always remember it's a sexual health initiative. And it's called a trigger tape. There are 3 scenes in the tape, and they're very brutal. They're very honest. They're written by and are for community that is for primarily Black women living in Philadelphia. And they are the kinds of lived situations that are hard to figure out what to do with on the fly. So scenes around negotiating safer sex with an abusive partner is one. Somebody who's drug addicted, or working through drug addiction yourself too, losing a parent to HIV-3. And in a trigger tape, the tape is stopped at a kind of climactic moment. And then within an educational setting, you would talk about what you would do, how you would respond, what it's making you feel. So we use trigger in that response, but we also are aware of how trigger is used now for a trigger warning. It's a different use of the word trigger. So because we observe the 2 uses of trigger, at least 2, we also are aware that, the words we use, how they incorporate political ideas about community change. How can we honor previous words and also be aware of, where we are now. And that is something that I've lived through as somebody who has been in this struggle across decades of my life. So that's how Trigger works. And I was going to say, we have 3 timelines. So the book is also bracketed by 3 timelines. We think about AIDS in time, and we're going to present the most obvious timeline in that it's 6 periods of HIV cultural production, but that timeline sits in the middle of the book as well as a performative script that starts to jumble and be more creative and is mutually voiced. And then the third timeline is our what is a kind of videography, bibliography. It's the cultural objects that we've swam in that have mattered to us. And those are then also organized chronologically. So what we're going to do now is share the first timeline with you because we think our most clear intervention is in just thinking quite carefully about how AIDS has come in and out of silence over the many decades of cultural production. And Ted, do you want to share screen?
I mean, sure, but I just want to say also, I think the jury's still out, right? We thought that maybe the most important part of our book were these timelines, but you're going to read the book and maybe it's going to teach you a lot about video, or it's going to teach you a lot about how to have conversations. And so we're going to focus on that, but who knows what Justin's going to want to bring up, or who knows what you as the audience are going to want to bring up in your question and answer. So we're excited about that. So I'm going to share screen. That's me verbally saying it. And let's see how good I am at doing that.
And as we share the screen with you, we're going to briefly talk through our understanding of the 6 periods of AIDS cultural production, or what we call times. And just to begin, these are open for debate. They're porous. Even as we lay them out, we understand that certain objects won't fit properly in one or the other. They may bridge one of the timelines. And we're as eager for you to debate this with us as we are for you to, write it down with a piece of paper and say, oh, no, I understand, understand the times of AIDS. Because our method is conversation. So it's a conversation starter. But here's how we go. Do you want to go first, Ted?
Sure. Thanks, Alex. We start with pre-1981, AIDS before AIDS. The human immunodeficiency virus has been circulating within humans from as early as the 1900s in Cameroon and as late as the 1960s in the United States. There are lived experiences of HIV well before 1981, but these occur outside of discourse. Even so, a then unnamed illness impacts individuals and communities.
And I just say, we'll briefly gloss on these and then talk about them more with Justin. But what's important here is this idea of coming into discourse, so that HIV exists materially in ways that are matter to all of us. For those of us who have HIV, those who know people with HIV, communities that have been ravaged by HIV. But this moving into discourse and moving out of discourse is really what we're tracking in our timeline. And then the other thing is that this period is really based on some very important original research that Ted has done about Robert Rayford in St. Louis in 1969, the first person in the United States to be retroactively diagnosed as having died of HIV. Anything else on that, Ted?
No, we're good. Thank you.
Let's just, I lost it on my screen, so I just want to make sure that as you're toggling up that we don't, that it refocuses the screen share.
I am seeing it properly.
Okay. Now it's back. Perfect.
Our second period in the timeline of AIDS, or the times of AIDS, is from 1981 to 1987, which is what we call the first silence. And this is when human beings in communities are beginning to understand that they're dying. They're very sick. They're sick in ways that doctors and themselves and their friends are acknowledging. But the mainstream media, the government, healthcare systems are not acknowledging these bursts of pain. And from this silence, organizing occurs and coming into voice. But also, it's really important to say that a result, and I think we can hold this in relationship to thinking about the pandemic that we're also living in right now, as a result of the lack of noise a once possibly manageable health crisis becomes an epidemic. So it is in these 6 years that we change the horizons of this epidemic and this viral epidemic.
And
you want to
and I would just remind us that it doesn't mean that there wasn't things happening. People were being diagnosed. Community members living with HIV were trying to figure out how to live and die with dignity, and lots of action was happening. It just wasn't coalescing into an undeniable sound, and whatever sound was being made was being hushed by a lack of action by the Reagan administration and a media that was maybe ill-equipped at the time. That's my generous read.
Generous. So our next period of AIDS is 1987 to 1996. It's your turn, Ted.
This is what we call AIDS crisis culture. And one thing that we think is really interesting to point out is that most of the AIDS culture that is celebrated in the present, most of the AIDS culture that is maybe become iconic is from this period, from 87 to 96. So from the Silence Equals Death poster to a lot of the poetry that you would be aware of, to the theater, a lot of that was made in this time. And it's important to think about how this was a period of mass cultural production, but also mass death, mass pain, mass reaction, mass power. And it led to social, political, and medical breakthroughs.
From 1996 to 2008, which we begin with the introduction of HAART and a new quality of life for people who have access to ongoing and consistent healthcare and medication. But also what we call the second silence is also a waning of monetary support for AIDS, a waning of public outcry as people are either healing or in trauma from the many deaths that they've witnessed, the people that they've loved who have died, and the fighting that they had been engaging in during AIDS crisis culture. This is a very dark time for many people, but for some people, they enter into HIV/AIDS during the second silence. One of the things that we're really trying to name for you all is, and for ourselves, is that I entered early because I'm 58 years old. Ted enters this history at a slightly different time. So our relationship to these periods are different in how they sound or feel to us. But I will say, as somebody who made AIDS crisis culture, that the second silence was a period of aloneness. You know, it's like this community that I had went away. This ready set of words that I knew were no longer available for me to use in sort of common parlance amongst my activist friends. And so it was a time of quiet. It was a time of hurt. It was a time of healing. And lots of activity occurred during the second silence. So this is something we learned by thinking about it. It just didn't connect quite. Mm-hmm. So many communities were working very hard in the face of HIV struggles and needs, and we're making work. It just wasn't hitting at the level that we then see in our next timeline, a moment in time, which is from 2009 or 2008 to the present, what we call AIDS crisis revisitation. Ted, you want to go?
Yeah, and Alex, I just wanted to just make space for something. So Alex gave you a little bit of sense of her age and her experience. And I was born in 79. That makes me 43 years old. So even though I was alive during the first silence and I was aware of AIDS crisis culture happening, I would say that I very much came into the world of HIV within the second silence. That's when I was looking for culture for and by people like me that I would recognize. Alex, before I move on, do you want to talk a little bit about you coming into HIV through AIDS crisis culture, or do you want me to keep going?
I mean, I was a feminist. We wouldn't use the word queer yet, but, you know, I was coming into New York City at the age of 23 as and entered ACT UP at the age of 23. Most of my best friends and the people I loved were gays and lesbians. The people in my lived communities had HIV. I mean, there wasn't a way to live in New York City and be a young person and not be radicalized by HIV. So I was primed to do it. And I volunteered at the Gay Men's Health Crisis at the age of 23 and said I could make a video. I made one of the first videos about women and AIDS in the world. I, didn't know how to make a video really, because it, at that time, how could you not know how it was the work I had to do, and I've just stayed in. So.
Yeah, and then on the flip side of that, I feel like I came into AIDS, into the world of HIV in the second silence because I didn't know how to be in the world not through HIV, but I couldn't find any cultural production about HIV. And I was yearning to talk about HIV in the present, but that wouldn't come yet. Instead, what came first was 2008 to the present, which we call AIDS Crisis Revisitation. And you might remember this distinctly in your life. After a period of little to no cultural production that kind of hit the quote unquote mainstream, all of a sudden there was this deluge of amazing and confronting and sometimes frustrating AIDS cultural production, like Oscar-nominated films or revivals of plays on Broadway or mentions on TV shows. And it was very exciting to be talking about AIDS again, even if it was only primarily about the past, and it made it harder to see the present. And within this revisitation, so much was happening. It wasn't all glory and like, let's remember the old times and memorialization. It was also, and it's still ongoing, it's deep conversations about race, gender, sexuality, prevention, undetectability. How do you memorialize something while it's still ongoing? That is AIDS Crisis Revisitation. And at the same time the revisitation is happening, Alex, do you want to tell us about the last one?
Yes, and just to say, Ted and I met during AIDS Crisis Revisitation. We met trying to make sense of why, as people who were in the AIDS response in the second silence, suddenly there was noise. And we began to talk to make sense of that, including my own work. So I made a piece of AIDS Crisis Revisitation, which was looking at the death of my best friend from AIDS at the age of 29 before treatment. So Ted and I are conversing about AIDS Crisis Revisitation. A lot of our conversation is critical, honestly. That criticism gets written into the revisitation itself, so that where the revisitation starts out as backward focus, primarily focused on New York City, gay white men in New York City, a criticism that begins to allow other voices, other stories, other regions, other places, other times to be part of the conversation, but also to, there's so much conversation in a certain sense. There's so much work that this backward focus and this sorrow, this healing, this trauma focus works. We actually say that part of what it does is begin to allow people to open their eyes again and say, oh, what's happening now? And people are talking about AIDS in the present, or AIDS in relationship to other traumas or other tragedies or other systemic dysfunctions, other viruses, starting in 2016. And we use that date because Trump says that he is going to work on ending AIDS. It's like, okay, if Trump is saying that there's something normalizing in the kind of like queers don't like the normal sense, like, and there's something in normalization which also makes it less exceptional. So HIV becomes one among many concerns, but not the only concern or the concern that stops conversation. So we are still trying to figure out what AIDS crisis normalization is, but we do know that it sees AIDS in the present, and it puts AIDS into dialogue with other concerns, with both that negative and positive aspect to it. So kind of a flattening or defanging of HIV, but also a kind of flowering or transformative possibilities to think about like how HIV has been radicalizing for communities and has been empowering for communities. So that's where I would end. And unless you have something to say, we have a question for Justin to move on to his.
Yeah, I just think we don't want to leave the timeline without just explaining that the reason why crisis is in brackets is because those square brackets if you're an editor or a grammar nerd, you know that that means you don't say it out loud, and not for better and only for worse. What we would say is happening is that within this normalization of HIV/AIDS, it is still a crisis for many people. If you are diagnosed tomorrow and you live in a state that doesn't have decent sex education or information about insurance, you might not know what's available to you, and it might be horrible for you. And there's lots of people we know who are living with HIV who for many reasons do not want to know their status, and so it is a crisis for them. And maybe throughout this conversation we'll talk more about the ways that the crisis is still real. But yeah, I'm going to stop sharing, and then Alex, do you want to ask Justin our question?
I do, and I guess just say again, you know, some people are not through their trauma. And I have no interest in telling somebody how long that should take or what it looks like or if they ever will get to another phase. And so HIV may be a crisis for them for their whole lives. And that is how crisis stays in the bracket. Well, and what that crisis means may change in relationship to their own diagnosis or, you know, the life in their community. So Justin, the question for you is, when did you enter? Which moment in the timeline sort of resonates with you as sort of how or when you entered and what the world felt like for you that brought you into AIDS culture?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. And I feel like for me, the way that I entered was kind of between the AIDS crisis culture and the second silence, because there are elements of both of those periods that really resonated with me. So the first notion of AIDS in my personal life was when my uncle died in 1989. He was the first person that I knew that died of AIDS. And even though I was 9 at the time, so I didn't really quite understand what was happening, but I knew that he was a Black gay man. And as I was trying to come to terms with my own sexuality, even as a young person, it scared me. And it scared me not only because of his death, but also because of the silence that surrounded his death. Mm-hmm. So when I went to college, I wanted to do work that would in some way kind of honor his memory. And so I was really interested in becoming a physician and working on HIV. But literally the first day of school, which was very fortuitous, I ran into a person who would become a good friend in the future. And he handed me a couple of pamphlets to come down to the local HIV service organization in Providence, Rhode Island, and to volunteer. So I guess he clocked, like, here's this little young Black boy, I need to make sure he understands what's happening with HIV. But it was really important that was sort of how I entered into the conversation, because it was through the network of people I met at that agency, I got a sense of my history as a Black gay man. I was introduced to Marlon Briggs, Estes Hemphill, Josephine, and these writers and activists that were Black gay men who were all, sadly, none of them are with us anymore because they all have died of AIDS-related complications. But through that sort of cultural lens, even though I was really interested in sort of the public health and medical aspects of it, I actually started out in sort of this cultural lane, and that I think gave me a very different lens of the history of HIV and why it's important to my community. I think for me that it all really came together was in 2000, I helped to organize a conference at my undergrad, which was Brown University, that was hosted by an organization based in New York City called Gay Men of African Descent. And we brought together hundreds of Black gay men to the campus of Brown, an Ivy League university, to have an explicit conversation about the HIV crisis, specifically among Black gay men. This was right around the time that CDC was producing data looking at some of the kind of disparities in HIV that were faced by Black gay men in particular. And so that was a way to kind of bring this world of sort of public health and medicine, but also the activism and the cultural production all together for me. So that's kind of how I come to this work.
Wow.
I silenced myself, but I want to say one thing about your comment that also connects us back to how the second half of the book is organized around silence. But one of the arguments we make about the timeline is that silence is live in all of the periods, that silence defines the AIDS cultural response. And so, the silence around people who died of HIV/AIDS within the Black community, within other communities for different reasons around, religion, let's say, or homophobia, around sexism, fear of drug use. I mean, there's lots of reasons why there's silence, but that's been definitive in all of these times. And then a reaction to silence, like having a conference, that like this silence, and silence equals death. This silence is killing me. And my response to the way that it's not literally killing me, but culturally killing me, produces AIDS cultural production. Even at the periods of most volume, there can be silence. Yeah. And so this is something that we worked very hard on to understand together.
Absolutely. And that comes through in the book. I mean, something that I really, really appreciated about the opening of the book is that when you talk about the Babashi videos, and there's this centering of kind of Black women in the AIDS conversation in a way that is pretty radical and important from sort of what you see in these mainstream productions of AIDS, right? So it's not in the band play line where we're censoring sort of gay white men. And I think that's important. And you also end the book in that way, talking about some of the women who actually worked to make sure that the AIDS definition included women. And so I was really very appreciative of that as a kind of starting place for the book. And also that you highlighted work in Philadelphia. I feel like most of the conversations that we have center on San Francisco, New York, but there was actually a lot of really important work coming out of Philadelphia in terms of the organizations, but also some of the folks that were doing important work there. So I think of someone like, Joseph Beam was also writing at this time. So I think trying to bring in different localities into the conversation was really, really important. So I really am appreciative of that. So I want to start with a question to you, Alex. As you mentioned in your opening, you produced one of the kind of first films on AIDS in women, like anywhere in the world. And you have really done a lot of work in kind of the video space. And you have this beautiful passage in the book where you talk about like lugging all these tapes when you moved from New York to California. And so it got me thinking about archive, and that's a theme through the book as well. So I'm just wondering, like, how do you think about how archival work should be positioned to be maximally useful to the communities that the archives are hopeful help serve?
I love your question. And it's first of all, I just want to thank you for reading the book. I want to thank you for your time. And like, you write a book so you can have conversations with people like you, so thank you for the question. I'll say two things about AIDS archives. One of the things that Ted and I talk about a lot in the book, and maybe Ted can follow up on this, is the stewardship and who takes care of the things that have been made around HIV/AIDS. And one of the things we learned very quickly is why is that held by gay organizations? And why is AIDS production held by gay white men? So one, because they have capital, but two, the crisis has been shunted off to that space. And so what that means is something like the Babashi tape was only in my office because I took care of it, because I wrote my doctoral dissertation on AIDS video. And so without the we need Black organizations, women's organizations, peace organizations, having AIDS archives too, to understand how this epidemic has been central to the concerns of those organizations. And every time we go through gay organizations, we miss work, fundamental work across the decade. So part of it is about like stewarding objects and who archives. And we think about that a lot, and what falls out of history. And I guess the other thing is, like, as an AIDS activist video maker, and as somebody who still makes those videos and also thinks about what to do with them, I think that the work of archiving is part of the activist project. And it's only in this decade where we're really thinking about, like, online archiving, saving things, that people understand, like, you make it, sure, but do you have a plan for saving it? And the plan for saving it is as important as the plan for making it. And so I want to think about conscientious archiving, especially of radical work, especially of marginal work, especially of the work that is diametrically opposed to mainstream. What are our plans for saving it? And so the book really looks at these very small objects in part as a process of saving and reanimating. So that's what I would say.
Yeah. Ted, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I do think it's a lovely question to start us off with. And to Alex's point about the need to be thinking about archiving, I'm thinking about your t-shirt, and your t-shirt is not an archive, but it is an index which points to archives or points to the need to be researching or looking. And I think part of our plan, or part of what Alex and I do in the book, is we're pointing in all these different directions. And so we are two writers and two activists who believe we could write 5 books about everything that's wrong with AIDS cultural production in the world, but actually we made decisions to say what's amazing, what's good that's still in danger of getting lost, and how do we actually speak our truth. And our truth, my truth, is that AIDS has always been intersectional for me. I went to start volunteering at an AIDS service organization, and I was one of 2 white cis gay men. Everybody else was representing other whole worlds. And so I've never known a kind of narrow version of HIV except for through quote unquote mass media. And so it is my duty, it is my honor, it is my work to keep that truth of me and my home community alive.
Wonderful. So to kind of follow up on that, Ted, I wanted to ask you, so you all talked in the book that when you met with the current executive director of Babashi, the sort of institutional memory of the tape that starts off your book was sort of lost, right? And so that got me thinking, and as I was reading the book, even as someone that's done work in HIV for 20 plus years now, there are so many stories and nuance that you raised in the book that I'd never heard about, right? And not to say that I would know everything, but it to me raises this question of, what do you think we can do to make sure that sort of that handoff and that history is sort of, the legacy is sort of passed down to future generations? Like, how should we think about what that process should look like?
Everyone should write a book. No. I mean, Justin, one of the reasons that we're so excited and ecstatic that you're doing this event with us is that you are an example, and you and people you love and work with are an example. You know, when I think of the counter narrative tribe, like, that is exactly what the work is. The work is making community rooted in surviving and thriving and surviving in a world that doesn't always make space for us, and talking about the cultural objects, the people we love, our crushes, gossip, food, and in that are the truths of the hard to talk about things. So I don't know when you first got to talk about your uncle with people outside of your family, but I'm guessing that you got to meet other people and go from there. And so that's one thing. I will also say I am in St. Louis, Missouri right now because of my work around Robert Rayford. And I just came from this event, and it was called What is Viral? What is Value? And it was an open mic. And we invited everyone who wanted to come to and it was at Griot, the Black Museum of History here, and who has an archive called Impact AIDS, which is rooted in the Black experiences of HIV here. And we have a Robert Rayford oral history project there. And all of that is to say about 30 of us came together in the basement of the Griot, and we shared our in-process work. Some of them were amazing poems, some of them were in progress, and all of them were rooted in this understanding that that in our foundation is the history of HIV. You can't tell the story of the United States of America in the 21st century without including HIV. So how do we make spaces for people to just bring that thread in? They don't have to write a book like we did. I was joking, but people have to make space for each other to say, my uncle has HIV, I have HIV. My first sexual experience was with a woman living with HIV. And we have to make those spaces, and we have to make them judgment-free.
And I would just add quickly, one of the things we try and model is cross-generational dialogue. Mm-hmm. And, that's just fundamental. And so, finding or creating the opportunity to speak with someone who's not your generational peer is one of the ways we hand this knowledge off. And I would say that, this idea of Ted enters to intersectional feminism, so do I. And then, we were talking that way. My Women in AIDS documentary for GMHC is fundamentally founded in what we now call an intersectional analysis of race, class, gender, and sexuality. And anyone thinking about HIV at that moment understood there was no other way to talk about it. So it isn't, part of why we move this thing forward is to say, you're not inventing it in real time. It's actually decades of thinking, really good work on this. And you can learn from some of the stuff that we were doing in the decades previous. We were smart then too, mm-hmm. and, absolutely. Awake. And so I think,
No, I love that. And Ted, I do want to come back to your work on Robert Ruffer. I think it's really, really important. So I hope that we'll have space to have you share a little bit more about that. So something else that I looked by as I was reading the book, you have a chapter around memorializations. And I was really struck again about the amount of history that you chronicled in the book, and how much of this is not taught. I didn't learn this in public health school or any of the sort of places that I've been. And thinking about this process of how do you memorialize an epidemic when it's going on. And I was struck by a conversation that you had with some of your students. You all came up with this really amazing list of things that people should think about. And I'm just wondering if you might talk about that process of how you came up with that list and sort of what some of those principles are. I thought they were really helpful.
If you have the page number, that would be helpful. But also what I'll say is it is an honor to educate people, to be a teacher. And one of the things that happen is people take an AIDS class, or they often, especially when they're young, go through what I would call an AIDS phase. And they think it's going to be a de facto LGBT history course. Mm-hmm. And it's not that. But it, like I said before, it is also a world history class. It is a US history class. And it is a current US class. And one of the things that I find interesting, and I would love it if someone could push back, because I don't know if I'm 100% right about this, is that AIDS is very unique in the sense that it is one of the only things I can think of that gets memorialized while it's still ongoing. So that's one uniqueness about HIV. The other uniqueness is most illnesses do not get memorialized. They do not get public space in the same way. Where's the Hep C memorial? Where is the breast cancer memorial? Where's the diabetes memorial, right? And so if there's going to be HIV memorials, we have, as somebody who's deeply invested in the community, we have to take accountability and consideration for why and how we do that. And so the number one thing that the class understood and reflected back to me is that historically, memorialization is the best way to forget things. How a culture attempts to try to narrate the story of their survival is by making a monument so that the structure holds the story and the people are allowed to forget it. So we know that a memorial actually has to be action-based. And that's always been true with HIV/AIDS. The earliest memorials were gardens that you needed to tend to and quilts that people made, right? So it's always been action-based. And I say now, and this was what I learned from the class, is that the best AIDS memorials now is the activism we do. So to me, needle exchange is the best memorial to HIV/AIDS because it's building upon the skills that people lived and died for, and it's making sure that no one's death was in vain.
And I love that section of the book also because you give a shout out to one of my favorite Erykah Badu songs, 80, 2000. So I was reading that and thinking about that song. And for those of you that don't know the song, there's a line that says, "You won't be naming no buildings after me, go down dilapidated." So I think that's a really important soundtrack to this conversation. So that's from Erykah Badu's Mama's Gun, brilliant album. Listen to it if you haven't already. Alex, so on page 124, you had this just quote that like stopped my heart. And you said, "We stopped talking about AIDS because everything had already been said, and one generation's pain cannot sustain a movement or really much of anything." And that just like, can you say more about what you meant in that passage?
Yeah, there's a lot of people like me who lived for all kinds of reasons, who were young and even middle-aged when the HIV really was suffered in large numbers, and also people who died really painfully. And a lot of our movement thinks that the job, well, a lot of people my age think that our function is to hold all the space for that pain. All the space is for that pain. And you know why? Because the pain feels that big. It's not an unrealistic demand in the size of their pain or our pain. But it doesn't take into account generations of people who have come since, a changing set of outcomes and lived experiences of HIV, different sexual possibilities than we could understand before, there was medication and PrEP and PEP, and I mean, it's, et cetera. And so we deserve to be heard, and we deserve to live our truth, our loss, but it's only one among among experiences. But also, second silence is about getting stuck in that pain. And you can't have a movement. So even if it was just us, we had to move past that pain to stay moving and responsive and present. So it isn't about dishonoring loss or suffering or anyone who died, or anyone who held someone's hand, or, any of that. It's only about And also, I get tired of rehearsing my grief.
Wow.
So I want to be alive too, and present and working here. And so it's and then, there's some guilt about that also. It's because my job is supposed to remember those people and keep that moment of history alive. But my job is also to be present and to, encounter HIV and people with HIV and communities that are struggling and, thriving in the face of HIV now, under whatever the terms are now. And that's that understanding shifting terms as part of what it means to stay in a movement.
Thank you for that. So Ted, I want to go to you next. So as you talk about, you came into this work in Canada, where you're from. And I'm just curious of any sort of general observations that you can offer about the differences in the ways that Canada responded to AIDS culturally in ways that are different or unique from the ways that you see that cultural response in the United States, or sort of a more broad sense? Like, is there a way to characterize sort of the Canadian response to AIDS compared to the response in the United States, or just any type of contrast that you'd like to offer? Because I thought that was something interesting that I was curious about as I was reading the book.
Yes, thank you for that question. I just want to dispel right away any romantic notions that people have of Canada. So I am quote unquote nice, but that is whatever. So before I talk about some of the things, what I have to say is that the blood donor scandal and the blood bank scandal of Canada is still a mess that is yet to be fully uncovered. The same way that the United States bungled that and hurt people and needs to be responsible and held accountable for that is same in Canada. If you are an Indigenous person in Canada, the country of Canada has failed all Indigenous people in every respect, and that includes HIV/AIDS. The rates of HIV are much higher among communities that are disrespected in the country of Canada, and that includes Indigenous people. And then I would also say, in the same way that the United States, the story of the white gay men of 1981 becomes the first story of HIV, in Canada, if you don't pay attention, you think the same thing is true there. But the work of Dr. Vivian Namaste illustrates for us that the first people living with HIV in Canada were probably people of Haitian descent or people recently who migrated from Haiti. So newcomers, Indigenous people, people who need the government for their care were all deeply impacted by HIV. And that's true, right? So there's me giving you that background. The other background that I would say is that when you have universal health care, everything is different and everything is better. And so a major failing in the United States is that there isn't universal health care. So that was a big problem. The other thing I would say is because the US is such a leader in these things, all of these countries that I've had the chance to look at, their responses, whether it's Canada, Germany, US, all these other countries, they learned from the US's mistakes and they reached out to the impacted communities and empowered them. So I would say that Canada has the same sins as other countries, and we learned from the sins of the United States to make it a bit better.
Thank you for that. So one of the more interesting chapters for me, they're all interesting, but in chapter 10, you all bring up this concept of undetectable, and you kind of play with that in many different ways, which is really fun for me to read about. Because, in my day job, I work at an agency where we are sort of laser focused on getting people living with HIV into care and helping them achieve this undetectable status or viral suppression. And so, but you don't talk about undetectable just as sort of a state of viral control. You kind of play with it in these other interesting ways. And I'm just wondering, if you could talk a little bit more how you think about the duality of the concept of undetectable kind of as you think about it, both from a medical and from a cultural standpoint. And also, if you can, I'm wondering how that conversation might tie in with something like Stephen Thrasher's really brilliant new book, The Viral Underclass. So either one of you or both of you can respond to that. So
I'm going to ask Ted to go first, if you don't mind, because we debated when to let undetectability enter the conversation, and we kept pushing it farther.
Interesting.
Back. I mean, a lot of conversation about when we were going to even say the word, because it does have a important resonance with our theorizing of silence. And we didn't want to get lost in that. And it would have been quite easy to lose undetectability under silence. And so it shows up a bit late, actually, I think. And Ted was really pushing me, I believe, to wait. And I would love to hear him talk now about what that was about, or thinking about it later. Is that okay, Ted, to ask you that?
Yeah, but Alex, so to this question, one of the great things about working with someone brilliant is that you do mind meld and you can't remember things. And so, Alex, I think I don't exactly remember my argument. Do you remember my argument?
No,
I love this.
no, I don't. I just remember like you making me take it out.
Okay, so part of it is, so I don't know if this is the reason, but I would say first and foremost for both Alex and I is that there's nothing, HIV is not an idea that we think is interesting. We understand that it's a material reality. And even though we are both white, cis, HIV negative people, HIV has materially impacted our lives. And specifically, it lives in the body of people we love, we care about, that we've had sex with, that have died. And so both of us have a respect that nothing is just for writing's sake. And that's true with undetectability. If we're going to introduce undetectability, it first and foremost has to be what it means for people living with HIV. And then we can start to play with the metaphor, and then we can start looking at that. One of the frustrations I have, and I don't know if this was, Alex, what you were alluding to, but I'm so curious. We knew from early on that if the medication was working, then the transmissionable question was mute. And so why did it take so long? And why were medical providers suppressing that knowledge of people living with HIV? And so I don't know, Alex, if that's exactly it, but that is something that I think about all the time. And I hope that there is some smart person in Atlanta or anywhere that will do a history of this despicable idea that people living with HIV were kept from their own power for so long because the medical profession was trying to suppress this knowledge. And Sarita Golub often will suggest that it comes from thinking that there has to be a price for pleasure. And heaven forbid people living with HIV know that they can have as much and great sex if they are on the treatment that works for them. And treatment is medication. Treatment is the food that makes sure that the medication works. Treatment is housing that makes sure that their medication is in a safe place. Treatment is respect and love.
And I guess the only other two things I would add, so thank you, Ted, thinking about it right now, is that, we do say in the introduction that we are not of the school, and I would love to know what you think about this, so like HIV is going to be over. And, we're counting down the days, and that undetectability is somehow like on the countdown to HIV being over. And when we talk about that, it's not that we wish HIV to be in the world, but we say that even if HIV is undetectable, even if people are in treatment and living long lives, AIDS is with us as a cultural and psychological and sexual and community-based truth that will live until, all of us are long past, but even, probably longer because of the really important work that happened in the face of HIV, that the medical work, the cultural work, the work around, patient-led activism, around sexuality, how it changed, what it was to be gay and lesbian and queer in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't want undetectability to get in the way of an argument about the importance of culture and memory and like future thinking, having the space for AIDS and HIV. And I guess the other one is that we thought a lot about how in the second silence, undetectability, changes discourse. And, one of the things that was really cool about AIDS crisis culture was there was a lot of discursive work, like what it means to say certain things, and a lot of language that we fought about, as is true of all movements. And some of that kind of went away in the face of undetectability. So like, even like we would talk about people coming out with HIV or serodisclosing in a public setting, which would have been like politically the norm or what AIDS crisis culture wanted. And then that changed in the face of, and so that was a discursive change in the face of undetectability that I think we still haven't completely processed politically as a political discursive conversation. And that's what we understand as AIDS crisis culture, is having those conversations about words and what is said and what is silent and who you say to whom, what you say to whom. And undetectability, is really deep in that sense, I think. So that would be the answer. I wonder what you think about it, Justin.
Well, I wanted to respond to something that Ted offered in his response. And I think one of the fundamental reasons, and I also agree with you, I'd love to see sort of a deep dive into sort of the story of undetectable as a concept. But I think it's connected, at least in part, to the way that in a biomedical or public health model, sex is conceived fundamentally as risk, right? And I think, thankfully, there is a move in public health and medicine writ large to sort of move away from that language. There's a lot of conversation on HIV spaces in particular, really not talking about risk populations or risk groups, to really move away from that type of language, to understand that sex is about pleasure, connection, but that's not sort of the fundamental way that public health has historically looked at it. So I think in some ways it's connected to that sort of the epistemology that public health has about sex. So, but there's clearly more to it than that. And I also love that, you really do begin with kind of understanding what this means for people who are living with HIV, and sort of that's the center. So I just want to thank you for making sure that that is core to the argument. And then something else that I was struck by as I was reading the book, it's actually even in my job title, which I didn't come up with myself, I would say that, but there's the notion of ending AIDS, and we're all working on this initiative that, as you point out, was actually initiated under the previous administration, called Ending the HIV Epidemic. And so there's, as you think about sort of discursive work, that certainly does a lot of labor in that. And so I was excited to sort of see kind of the critical lens you even had around that language, which I don't think in public health circles, there hasn't been much conversation about that. So I thought that was just a helpful reminder and intervention. So I just wanted to thank you for that.
I think that we can just sit with that in relationship to the way that, like, right now the president is saying, COVID is over. It's a violent language that is so disrespectful to anyone in pain, to anyone who is sick, to anyone who has loss. It's so fundamentally disrespectful of people's experience, lived experience. And so that they can both resonate. Saying something is over just wipes away the lived experience of millions of people. It's callous, I think. So
I know we're coming up on time, and there's so many other things that I wanted to talk to you about. So I think I'll end here. So you have this really powerful quote from Hugh Ryan, and from a New York Times editorial that he wrote. And in it, he writes, "Bad history has consequences. I'm not afraid we will forget AIDS. I'm afraid we will remember it, and it will mean nothing. If we cannot face the root issue that we let people die because we did not like them, AIDS will be a blip on our moral radar, and the cycle will repeat every time we connect an unpopular group with something that scares us." And I had not read that quote before, but it immediately brought up so many things around stigma, and most immediately I thought about monkeypox and sort of the current conversations that we're had around that. And so that was just, I just want to thank you for helping me kind of make that connection. And then I really wish that you could talk more about your work on Robert Rayford, but that's like a separate conversation. So I'll end with this question. I really loved that the book was really a set of conversations between the two of you. And I'm just wondering how your friendship has evolved as a result of the process of writing this book together and having these really intense, challenging conversations with one another. Like, I think that's what I was really struck by, was how much respect you have for each other, how much you were willing to like push each other and go there. So like it was really just a beautiful model of how to hold difficult, challenging conversations. But I'm just wondering kind of how that changed how you relate to one another.
I mean, Alex, Justin, that's a very generous question. Thank you. This book is primarily, one of the many gifts it gives, I think, is about conversation. And even the fact that you picked up on that Hugh Ryan quote, even that we're talking about Vivian Namaste and Marlon Bailey, like we are in conversation with each other, and we are in conversation with the dead, with the living, with the brilliant, with the yet to be known, right? We're in conversation with you right now. And so all of those relationships are really important. And Alex and I bring two different worlds somewhat connected to each other. So I just want to name that. But just to gas Alex up a bit, she is the best processor you will ever meet. We had some very tense times, but I will tell you, you know someone loves you when they say, let's talk about this. When you do something that upsets them, and instead of just staying shut down, they say, I need to process this with you. And Alex kept on doing that. And so that's point one. Point two, I will say, is anytime I ever got frustrated with Alex, I would think, oh my God, imagine what Alex has to put up with me. You know? And so I would just remember that anytime, so that way I would say that. And then number three, can you imagine getting to write a book with such a brilliant person who is, so one thing that made this whole book possible is that Alex and I were curious about what the other person was thinking. We would watch the best movie or the worst movie separately, and then we couldn't wait to talk to each other about it. Come on.
All right, I'm mindful of time.
Yes.
But, you know, I really believe that activism is love. It's living. It's the best way to live. It's all we hope for. And, you know, I had a brilliant, marvelous experience getting to share so much space with Ted and learn so much from him and grow with him. And, you know, that's, I wish it for all of you. And it was super hard. And it's like one of the best things I did. Like, imagine writing 200 words with somebody else. I mean, 200 pages. It was magnificently important to me. And, you know, we want to model that space of like live, curious, not necessarily like thinking the same thing, that you can hold that and respect each other and, you know, love each other more for it. Like that is the work of activism for me. And that is the space of AIDS activism for me.
Mm. Well, what a beautiful place to end our conversation today. So I just want to thank you both for birthing this beautiful, brilliant conversation into the world. And I want to bring back ER from Karis to close us out.
Thanks, y'all. This was really great. I'm so glad that we all got to be here and listen to y'all talk and share a little bit in your generous brains. I want to encourage folks, if you don't have a copy yet of We Are Having This Conversation Now, click this teal button at the bottom center of the screen. That takes you directly to one click to buy it from Karis. It really does help us when you buy event books from us. You can also support the work of Karis Circle, which is our nonprofit programming arm, by clicking on this donate button that's just popped up. That really does help us. Any amount, there's no amount too small. It really does help us in our work. The last thing I'll say is we always encourage you to request that your public library carry this book. So one form of activism that is free and very necessary is to get this book into public libraries. So librarians often tell us we don't have as much power as the patrons do. So request. And that is one way, particularly as queer folks and as marginalized folks, to make our presence known. So if you want to see books like this in your library, and especially if you want them for future generations, we have to ask for them. So don't be shy, ask for them. Thank you both, Alex, Ted, really appreciate it. Justin, you are lovely as always. And thank you to Positive Impact for co-sponsoring tonight.
What a beautiful space you guys have made at Karis. So thank you for having us in it.
Yes. Well, maybe one day you can physically come to Atlanta too. That would be great. Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.